In Canada, by 1948, post-World War II, the time was ripe for change in the art scene. First in Quebec, the Refus Global in 1947 was formulated and signed by an intense group of artists seeking an enlightened approach to art. Free experimentation toward tapping into the psyche, initiated to a degree by André Breton's Surrealism in Europe, was enacted in the spirit of experimentation and fresh, untainted discovery. West of Montreal, the Group of Seven, initiated in the 20s and holding sway even into the 40s, were generally perceived as historical with their wilderness as icon motto. By 1950, Torontonian artists formulated the Painters 11 group, and abstraction as a statement was first staged in a department store and brought about confusion, but with a direction. The Ave Isaacs Gallery took a similar stance with artists such as Graham Coftry and Gordon Rayner, and the tradition of abstraction was soon well rooted in Toronto, there in Ontario. In the USA, earlier in the 30s, under Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration, a mass employment scheme for relief in the Great Depression, the arts received a huge financial boost throughout the States, and 2,500 public murals were painted across the country under the WPA program. The 1950 thrust in New York, when the Irascibles staged their protest exhibition at the Radical Cedar Tavern artists, the fever around particularly Jackson Pollock spread around the globe. Light magazine's coverage of Jack the Dripper fueled the fever. In 1956, in Mexico City's Zona Rosa district, a whole new notion in contemporary art occurred. Focus left the great three of the muralists and went more towards Tamayo and his international approach. Artists such as Francisco Toledo were emerging, and Mexico's ancient traditions and mythology played a part in the new global awareness. With Toledo's training in Hayter's studio in Paris, a cosmopolitan knowledge dipped in Mexican mythology represented one extreme. As well, abstraction for its own sake flourished and a new era began. Youth and art around the globe had witnessed the Second World War and its devastation, and a new era of hope began. The big war was over. So May 20th, 1950, the Irascibles in New York City, the Metropolitan Museum, decided to boycott the American Painting Today show and replace it with a different show by Jackson Pollock, de Kooning, Klein, Rothko, and Motherwell. That's what our story is about, how it affected Canada, what led up to it in the USA, and what was going on in Mexico at the same time, how this major show did have an effect on all. So Group of Seven, this is the history of Canadian art, into Refus Global in Quebec, Painters 11 down in Toronto. USA, some of the earlier things, the Armory show, which David Milne's show did. World War II, Mondrian and Hoffman coming to Europe after Second World War, became teachers in New York, which also affected many of these people who were students of theirs. In Mexico, Padre Hidalgo, the first revolution, and then the second one, Diego Rivera's in Paris studying Cubism, called back to do murals with Tamayo and Orozco. And then we have the 1950s and 60s in Zona Rosa in Mexico City. 40 years before the Impressionists, Turner was journeying through England and Italy, landscape painting and painting ruins. He developed an essential language for light, one that explored the surface of the canvas for its own visual excitement. The ocean studies furthered his observations of nature's changes and extended this new language. The tradition that developed around the outdoor painters in France, a time when small tubes of oil paint were first accessible and when rapid overland travel by train was replacing boat cruising on canals, Monet, penniless for the most part, developed an approach where light changes were of essential importance. Quick impressions led to surface structures rich in nature. Vincent van Gogh was as concerned with light as much as the Impressionists, but was also a social realist, and man's duty and plight became as much an issue as the visual realities. His study of nature therefore had an expressionistic edge, and often landscape was the place of man's dwelling for Vincent. Maurice, a Canadian who studied law, then painting, traveled to Paris and roamed through Europe, rendering European landscape, at first in darker tones. Returning to Quebec lightened up his palette, especially in winter, Then Matisse and the Fauves injected him with brighter colors. He traveled and painted with Matisse in Europe. Other voyages to Morocco, Tunis, and Cuba brought decorative themes to his work. David Milne left Canada for New York as a teenager for an illustration course. Miraculously, he got accepted with 5 works in the historic 1913 Armory show. Difficult times brought him back to Canada, and his landscapes with Nabi influence, particularly Bonnard. Even as his masterworks were completed, he became sick and died relatively unknown. Cézanne worked independently from all that was going on with the Impressionists and Manet in Paris, and followed Poussin's example, searching for a solid structuring of the work. Pissarro convinced him to paint out of doors and to simplify his color scheme, brightening them up. Finally, he arrived at a surface structure that included Impressionism and, importantly, geometry. This new vision affected everything that was to follow, Cubism being the most immediate movement after him. In Paris, Picasso and Braque were the leaders of the Cubist movement, and Apollinaire was their poetic spokesman. Juan Gris, Messenger, Glisses, Sorensen, Léger, Picabia, Marcel Duchamp were the ones he selected and gave full support to. The Parisian public and critics rejected Cubism stubbornly until Apollinaire won out, same thing that had happened with the Impressionists in their time. As Paris in the 20s was attracting artists from around the world, and the Russians were quick to join in, Malevich, Foucault, and others were wide open to benefit from the lesson of the Cubists, taking it further into formal constructivism. Artists came forward as directors and teachers in the revolution in Russia, and enjoyed a free period of great experimentation until Stalin imposed his lugubrious statuary on the public. Meanwhile, Malevich's white on white and red squares floated in a formal constructivist open field. In the realm of the third dimension, Rodchenko's sculptures spiraled in huge plazas or on theatrical stage sets. Then Stalin happened, and all went into hiding. Only 50 years later did the Greek collector Kostakis go to Russia and unearth the hidden and forbidden collections that had fallen hand in hand with reason into obscurity. Family members and relatives had stashed away packages in long-forgotten attics and cupboards. As well, Stalin sealed much of the art in vaults, but gradually the collection resurfaced and a bit of art history was renewed. A touring show in the US and Europe put Malevich and company back on the map. Kathleen Munn, a Canadian artist exposed to Cubism through American schools, employed color and cubistic structuring in her mountainscapes. She stands out from her contemporaries, the group of 7, for allowing a degree of formality into the painted wilderness. In some ways, she could be likened to Emily Carr in this respect. Arthur Lismer seems to be the best liked and the happiest of the group of 7, and the one who gave most freely of his time and of his gifts. He taught for years at the Art Gallery of Ontario, as well as at the Montreal Museum's School of Fine Arts and Design. He was a keen observer, like a heron, tall and thin, and was always warm with his generous humor. As a rebellious young painter in Guanajuato in the 20s, Diego Rivera, like so many other artists from around the world, was drawn to Paris and Picasso's Cubism. Being adept at figure painting and caricaturing, he then added a new structural technique to his vocabulary. Many portraits that engage geometry and structural compositional arranging repeat themselves as the canvas's flatness becomes one with the message it carries. A decorative element natural from his Mexican heritage engages easily in the interplay, and the spreading and flattening of the surface announces to a degree what will later appear in his murals of his destiny. With a stretch of the imagination, one could also see the E equals mc squared factor at work in Diego's Cubism. Inherent in all the work from Mexico, the mythology and the ancient sculptures of Mexico play a huge part. Some hospital paintings early back in Mexico also reveal his socialist tendencies, his concern with the plight of the common man. In fact, Diego, like Frida, who was to become his wife, were most at home in the street surrounded with their people. His officials with pistolas on the farmers signify his convictions or vision about the government's corruption and how the revolution had rooted out the ogres and reinstated the common man with some self-respect. Vasconcelos, the Minister of Education after the revolution, had requested Diego to return to Mexico to be involved in the creation of murals that literate and illiterate would understand alike. And a prerequisite was to visit different areas of Mexico and to soak up the mythology and history of each place, then to let that be reborn in the murals. And that is the way it went. Diego's Cubist training was perfectly appropriate to adapting his story to the flat surfaces in the architecture where the murals were to be located. Grand staircases were often involved. Later in the north, Diego did controversial murals for Rockefeller. The American astronaut was of great interest to Diego with his vision of the future, that the Leninist characters that crowded Rockefeller's notables rubbed the sponsor the wrong way, and some murals were not finally realized. The strong relationship between Diego and Frida Kahlo is legendary. This self-portrait reveals her strength, and to a degree the suffering she experienced in an early accident. Guadalupe Marin, a rival of Frida's, had children of Diego, which Frida didn't manage to do. Guadalupe's daughter, now 83, recently spoke in Montreal on her first step in a tour of Canada, France, and Russia, where she will lecture on Diego's murals. In spite of the rivalry between the two women for Diego's attention, they seemed okay with each other and coexisted pretty peacefully. José Clemente Orozco may well have been the best painter of the muralists, as his images were raw and universal, not particular and of a given story. Then again, Tamayo was the best colorist, and Diego the best storyteller, and Siqueiros the most experimental with materials, so it all depends on what does it for the individual. But in plastic terms and the rules of painting, Orozco was very powerful. He may have become a scientist, and in fact blew a hand off before going to painting. His graphic sense and chiaroscuro were influential on Pollock, a West Coaster like Orozco. The main murals of Orozco are in Guadalajara in the domes and cupolas of the cathedrals, as well as on the walls of the government palaces. For a kind of relief from high tension, his drawings also showed a lighter comic sense, with lounging nudes, moments of relaxation, one might say. The creation of a metaphor for the bestial side of mankind was something Orozco had access to. Rufino Tamayo was never a revolutionary like the other three muralists. He was a visionary of a different nature, and his dream allegories may be spiced with some of the flavor of picante revolución, but in essence they were dreams, hot dreams also, of a world closer to the ancient mythologies of Mexico. For this, some excluded him from the mission. His works are easier to look at. They please the eye and they seduce the soul. Octavio Paz saw them as the essence of the sun, so they have never been unpopular, but ideologically they weren't appropriate to the revolution. Tamayo collected pre-Columbian art and eventually opened a museum of his collection in Oaxaca. But the institutions of Mexico, as he traveled in Europe and lived and taught in the States, refused his international modern collection. So he had built a gorgeous museum of modern art in DF's Chapultepec Park, which is now highly honored. Tamayo taught some now famous American artists such as Helen Frankenthaler and had a real impact away from Mexico. The three mythological centers of North America are symbolized in a recent book and exhibition catalog, Places of Their Own, by Sharon Rolfson Udall, in the personas of Frida Kahlo for Mexico, Georgia O'Keeffe for the USA, and Emily Carr for Canada. A victory for the women, this is a meaningful definition in that the deeper mythologies of each place is touched on by the three women in question. Frida in the metaphorical heat of the south, Georgia in the aridness of the central west, and Emily in the deep wet forests of the north. As for the east, each in their own way being mysteriously independent personas, had eastern elements in them and had traveled east. Georgia to New York City, which he eventually rejected, Emily to study in Eastern America near the group of 7 personalities, then to Paris when the Fauves were in vogue, and Frida perhaps north and east to accompany Diego in the mural production. The cosmology they represent is a whole one, and in their search in art they epitomized a higher reality and a deeper one, rich in reference to the ancient myths of North America. In New York, at the Cedar Tavern, a group of radical artists who were bound together through experimentation decided that the current announcement by the Metropolitan Museum of Art of a show they called American Art Today was bogus, and they formed a manifesto to boycott the show and then set up their own paintings on the steep steps of the museum and showed the real exciting work of the day, those experiments that really went to uncharted territories. Many of these artists had studied at the Art Student League and had the benefit of leading adventurous European artist teachers who were forced out of Europe by the Second World War, people like Hans Hofmann and Piet Mondrian, and these senior students were now ready for action. Life magazine covered the event, and Jackson Pollock became the spokesman for the group, probably because he had taken the furthest steps forward to a truly new art form, that of the drip painting. Figure and ground gave way to an overall swirl of fine web-like lines that were a sort of extenuated body calligraphy. That was soon to earn the name of action painting, or abstract expressionism. If there was depth in these paintings, it was an infinite depth. If there was space, it was infinite space. Jackson went so far when asked if there was reference to nature as to reply, "I am nature." The public loved it and called him Jack the Dripper, and soon artists were imitating him all over the globe. Although de Kooning represents a more rational, northern cool approach than Pollock's intensity, and indeed he maintained the evolved grid of Cézanne and then the Cubist in his brand of action painting, there is certainly no lack of bravado in his oeuvre. His interest lay in maintaining a human scale, and so his canvases were no bigger than the natural reach of the human body, no dripping from all the sides or from above, as was the case with Pollock. De Kooning outlived Pollock, who died in a car mishap, by decades and produced a consistent, rather miraculous body of work which went on inspiring a global audience until his old age. After Pollock died, de Kooning moved very close in the country to where the body of his old friend was buried, and there he continued the work. At times he was scorned a bit, as with the paintings based on the woman, where the feminists took exception to the sensuality of his monumental yet abstracted nudes, but in the end he carried the torch of the 50s far into the present. Mark Rothko's immense color-saturated masses, stacked and hovering one over the other in monumentality reminiscent of Stonehenge, but entirely about light and deep emotions, became some of the most sought-after works of the era. This branch of abstract expressionism was deep-rooted and lasting, still being a strong global influence on many painters. Rothko's fame and difficulty with the pop art that followed the Cedar Tavern group led to a disappointing later career, but he remains a landmark in art history. When the dialogue between Fernand Leduc and Paul-Émile Bordois came to a head in Quebec, the Refus Global as manifesto brought about a historical Canadian cultural movement. Of all the artists involved, it was Jean-Paul Riopel whose work received most attention in Europe and globally. In Paris, where Riopel, Leduc, and John McEwen worked alongside of Sam Francis from California and some of the late surrealists like Salvador Dali, Leduc challenged André Breton and his fatalistic notion that surrealism was taking. Fernand Leduc, as the co-planner of the Refus Global, collaborating with Bourdois from Paris, refused André Breton's view of surrealism and asked, with Riopel, for something more precise, less fatalistic and absurd. John McEwen produced the first of a series of cell-like action paintings that then, under the influence of Francis, led to his overall Rothko-like massive paintings, the most serious works. Uninterrupted surface, no distinction between that and the background, earmarked the works of these pioneers of art. Back in Montreal, we see in the work of Robert Wolfe the early adaptation of Pollock that then led into a more Delaunay-like circular sun or target series where rich color is emphasized. Charles Gagnon left Montreal to study in New York, where he became a flaneur of the busy streets, acquiring a Rauschenberg notion to ready-mades and the always vital visual information of the action, as well as a de Kooning-like gestural notion. And this led him back home, where he was welcomed as a lyrical force in the art world in Montreal. The emphasis there by the mid-60s was shifting from automatism to the plasticien movement, and as a second wave in that vein, Molinari, Toussaint and Yves Gaucher were at the lead of a new direction. There were ongoing disputes between the two schools of thought, and art historian Francois-Marc Gagnon documented the transitions. Floor sculptures of Roland Poulin that in line and plank-like definition describe the room space were in keeping with the minimal nature of the plasticine movement. Gordon Smith on the West Coast in Vancouver was also, like Robert Wolfe, merging the Pollock-like network with forest scenes and pursued such images for years to come. Bruno Bobak, as a World War II artist, stayed in England to paint seaside scenes such as the Cliffs of Dover in Turner-like atmospheric mode. He returned to the west coast of Canada and became highly acclaimed there, as did his wife Molly Bobak. Sometimes Bruno's colors are Bonnard-like in their richness. Jack Shadbolt of Vancouver and post-war participant of the Art Student League in New York City brought Clement Greenberg to Emma Lake and then to Vancouver. His dedication to painting the coastline was a lifelong joy and inspiration. Ray Mead emigrated to Canada from England after World War II and joined Painters 11 in the 50s, and then continued abstraction for the next 5 decades. His gestural style evolved to contemplative, rich color fields with strategic iconographic marking. Harold Town, in a way the darling of Painters 11, was first known for his eloquent figure drawings, somewhat Picasso-like. He was very outspoken and would have nothing to do with Clement Greenberg and the American scheme. He practiced many different styles, was proficient at all, but master of which it wasn't certain. Jack Bush, the senior and best-known artist of Painters 11, on Greenberg's advice followed his own watercolor paintings and developed a highly popular, highly colorful body of works. He exhibited in New York and Boston and made it to the top. William Ronald had panache from the day he displayed the Painters 11 abstracts in the department store he worked for. Major institutions in New York purchased his work, but on returning he hosted a cultured TV extravaganza in Toronto.
Vai de luz sentar na borroz, iluminando caminho, minha destino. A mim já me conche felicidade. Oh Deus, que pura verdade, és boudinho de luz cima prata, bocadinha tá parecendo santa. Oh sis, boca luz de minha vida, já queria morrer se vou negar, querida. Esse boudinho de luz cima prata, bocadinha tá parecendo santa. Oh sis, boca luz de minha vida, já queria morrer se vou negar, querida. Dormi noite, sonhar que me acrediteu um sonho feliz para ser realidade. Pedi Deus para bem ser de meu. Sem bom amor nunca tem felicidade. Esboldinho de luz cima prata, boquerinha tá parecendo um santa. Ossis, boca e luz de minha vida. Já quero morrer se vou negar, querida. Esboldinho e luz cima prata, boquerinha tá parecendo um santa. Ossis, boca e luz de minha vida. Já quero morrer se vou negar, querida. Esboldinho de luz cima prata, bocarinha tá parecendo um santa. Ossis, boca e luz de minha vida. Já quero morrer se vou negar, querida. Esboldinho de luz cima prata, boquerinha tá parecendo um santa. Ossis, boca e luz minha vida. Já quero morrer